All right, so I want to talk about this email I got from Tommaso. He's a Unity developer, and he's trying to solve a problem of applying some solid principle standards inside of Unity. And it's based off of limitations and ideas from a talk I gave in 2017 at Unite. Now, the specific problem is that he has an interface. He has a class. I think in this case it's a scriptable object, and it implements two interfaces, IAttacker and IWalker. That would suggest that there also is some kind of component that's going to be inside of a game object for walking behavior. Maybe we'll just give them names: walking behavior and attacking behavior. And inside of those, I think he wants to have a reference to IAttacker. He doesn't care about the entire character. In fact, he wants other characters that also implement IAttacker and IWalker, because the attack capabilities and the way it works is pretty much the same for every single one of these. Or the way that they walk is pretty much the same. It's just different units have different capabilities in some odd mix of the sense. Okay, so it doesn't make sense for the objects to make references. So in Unity, in the IDE, you can't pass this responsibility onto a designer for interfaces. That has to be code by itself. As soon as you try making a reference to an interface that is public, that field won't be visible. It won't show up in the inspector. Now, one quick solution that kind of fixes all this right away is that you could go get Odin. Odin something or other. What was it? Do I have this one up here somewhere? And I don't see it. Oh, well. Oh, wait, I should do that one. And Odin, not in here. Oh, well. So Odin's on the Unity Asset Store. If you search for Odin serializer, or Odin Inspector, I think that's it. It provides all these incredible tools, including that when you have a public field that happens to be an interface on your component or your scriptable object, that will actually become a draggable field inside of Unity. That you can now just drag something, another game object or a component that carries that scriptable or that interface, and you can drag it in there, and it works. They are handling the serialization for that system. Awesome. Now, I'm not paid by them. They're not giving me anything for this. They did give me one license a while ago, and since then I've actually paid for 5 more. Just because of how valuable it is. And you need a seat for every developer who's on the team. Now, I consider this incredibly valuable. And that's a pretty good reason right there, that now you can support interface references. But there's a lot of other ones. Anyway, so with that one not necessarily being the solution to go for, because it's also going to cost money, and it's not working with Unity by default, what are some other options on how we can deal with this? Okay, so first of all, there's a limitation being imposed, Tommaso, that you put in here that the way that you referenced it, I think misinterprets what I was trying to say. So there's this line here. It's, as you mentioned in the video, it's good to expose as many fields as possible so that designers can fiddle with it without having to go through a developer. Okay, what I meant by that, and what it seems that you've written, you could also have the same understanding, and just the way it came out here sounds different, is that you should be designer-centric when you're creating those things. I do generally have this belief that that by default we will just make everything private and only expose the bare minimum of what is necessary. And we're not really taking into account as developers that we should probably expose other fields that designers would then be able to use. There are times where we're just multiplying something by 1, or just not multiplying something at all, and where we could just attach another field, put it in there for the designer to be able to edit, and now your lerp time is editable. It's not 1 second, it's multiple. That you have other things inside of here that you can take advantage of. So I want people to be thinking along those lines. I'm not necessarily saying that everything needs to be exposed, and you shouldn't be exposing your interfaces and trying to get them filled just for the sake of exposure. All right, so with that one kind of explained a little bit there, let's go into some general solutions, what I actually practice with this. Okay, so first of all, and with what I practice, I need to call out that I don't really depend on Solid anymore. Solid, just like anything else, is faulty. There is no perfect architecture for everything. At least not that we humans have been able to figure out. Every architecture is designed on a series of problems, and it has challenges to deal with those, but every project is different. A lot of projects will fall into the boundaries of any given architecture, but not all architectures. And not all architectures fit all problems. In fact, when we look at individual pieces of these, like a command pattern is great for undo, but it's going to take extra work, and if you're not actually using the undo feature, the command pattern really doesn't make as much sense for almost anything else. So your architecture is a series of patterns and principles, and solid is one set of options for it. So if you find a problem where it is blocking you and you're trying to attach it and trying to get solid to work, throw that out. Make your own. Understand the differences and live with it. A lot of times people just forget about these changes and just ignore them. They don't document them. They don't call out anywhere about these things. They just make it part of their code, and it goes into there, and now your code starts getting bad and ugly. All right, so let's go into some real solutions now. Vampire, we want to be able to pass off these interfaces. Now, you've already decided at this point that Vampire is a reasonable spot to house all the data required for Attacker and Walker. So that also suggests that your other unit types, your other character types, whatever type you might have, will probably also likely carry IAttacker and IWalker together. One quick solution, which I don't like, is that you could literally just have your walking script ask to get the character interface. And if it does that, it already knows this is where the walking information is. So you could throw out some of these concepts that you would immediately start to think to organize your code with. The question is, if that's the only type of thing that's going to move, and if that's the only type of way you have for things to move right now, that's not that bad of an assumption. A lot of times we're adding some of this architecture just because we want to keep our stuff flexible to do other things. But if we don't know what those other things are, and we're creating code to deal with things that we don't know what they are, what they're even for yet, that code is not likely going to survive that. So don't lock ourselves in with it. It's reasonable to still split that out by default if that's what you want, but if it blocks something else, be on with it. Okay, so that's one solution, the solution of simply asking for the Vampire class or a base type of that class that also happens to have the attacking and walking functionality in there by default. You could create a character scriptable object that Vampire inherits from. Okay, another option, and this is probably closer to what I might generally use. Again, depending on the nature of the project that I'm working on, I will implement different solutions. Okay, so one thing that I've done before, or in some cases, is that I will have an info class. You may have seen this if you followed along in the RTS series that I'm working on. In the RTS 22, I have an info class, and that info class holds on to information about the unit, the player, and its selection state, the object holding its selection. It doesn't have any intelligence with any of those, it just holds references to them, because so many different objects care about multiple pieces of information from it. Your system could be the same. Your system for your Walker could be looking for the same centralized component and just say, okay, give me the info class, or give me the unit class, or whatever you want to call it as. Give me this one centralized class that holds references to a lot of these key important things that a lot of these scripts need. And as the Walker component, I'm going to know to go get info and then say info.walker. And now that class is going to be responsible for passing off the Walker functionality. So that's only one level of understanding, and that's a reasonable one to have. Another layer on top of that, where you can start adding abstraction to really be able to maintain this interface segregation, is that you could make another layer of interface on top of this. Again, it's going to have to be the code asking for it, but in this case, we're going to get rid of that code's need to understand which component it comes from. So the getComponent functionality inside of MonoBehavior also supports interfaces. You can ask for them, and as so long as one of those components actually has that interface, it basically grabs a reference to the object and does a type check. If this is this, like that type of if statement, then it'll return it. So interfaces work. Okay, so you can pass in get your interface that way. Excellent, awesome. You don't need to worry about it. You can just ask for it. But then how is it going to get it? Something has to understand where that IWalker comes from. So it's not going to understand that a sub-member of one of your classes, of one of your components inside the MonoBehavior happens to be an IWalker. It's going to understand that the component is an IWalker. So you need a separate layer of interface above that, and I call this IGetISet. It's a very simple interface structure, and you could pretty much just do these as one-liners and have a dozen of them sitting in one file, and just outline the whole thing in one spot, where you basically say, public interface IGetIWalker, and inside you have a method that just says getWalker or getIWalker. And then that gets implemented in your info or unit class, that component or behavior that sits at the root of the class. And so your walker component, when it becomes awake, it's going to say getComponent IGetIWalker, and then call the method to get the walker, and it's got it. It didn't care where that came from. That's where a lot of this is coming from. A lot of this is trying to decouple these various things, so we don't necessarily need to know the structure. We're kind of locking people, the designers in, we're locking ourselves in the future to say an object has to look like this. It's brittle because most of the time that our code is locking the structure of an object like that, there's nothing about it that clearly expresses where these things need to be. That's not that's not implemented them. We might actually put together a document that shows it, but in a lot of cases, no, we just create our first object and write our code into it and add the extra objects and start building it out from there. So we start with a template and we pass someone a template that we've been filling in without the documentation to support it, without anything in the stuff to imply these type of dynamic things we expect. Okay, so by putting those interfaces in there, the IGetIWalker, we can do that. Another way you can approach this is the opposite, the ISet, the ISetter, where it's basically ISetIWalker. So that would have a function in called setWalker. And so you would say your class that actually has the walker, the Vampire script that has the IWalker capability or interface, when it becomes awake, it would do a search for getComponents, the plural version, and for each one that it comes back that is an ISetIWalker, it will call the setter. Usually this works better as a getter operation because you may actually have different times in your implementation that this is required to work. So the getter tends to be better, but sometimes you don't care to hold on to all the information that you need and you only need it during initialization, except for some certain rare cases. So your setters might work, be a better choice depending on what you're doing. Okay, so that's another option. Now there's another option on top of this that depending on what you're doing, I've done this one as well, there is a portion of what we would almost all call spaghetti code that doesn't have to be spaghetti code. We do a lot of architectural patterns and choices to get away from key areas of pain inside of our code. But the thing is that those are attempts to get around them, not perfect solutions to the problem. So spaghetti code. One thing that we would generally always call spaghetti code is when we have a cyclical reference. So we have, let's say we took Vampire, and instead of having Vampire hold on to this information directly, it has another class called Vampire Walkable. Now, you could create a reference between them and have logic that primarily exists, certain functionality that only exists for one particular one of those, but they each have references to each other so they can talk to each other. So your walker has code and data that's isolated to it that then you can pass into other stuff and say this is WalkerComponent. So your walking component can now just ask for a reference for walking scriptable. And that would work. That would cut out this need for it. You would be generating more scriptable object files though. And so you have to consider the pain point on that of creating and managing those. It's honestly not that complex though, especially when this doesn't happen that often. So I want to point out about this cyclical reference though. When you have this, and let's say that we now have our vampire class that has direct link reference to Vampire Walker, or Vampire Walker and Vampire Attacker, that is created as three separate scripts that are tightly coupled. Now that I think is fine. I think that is okay to do in your code as long as you, one, understand that you are doing this. It's not just a standard practice that you apply in your code to create a cyclical reference. It is a choice made when there isn't another particularly convenient one. So if you still need these objects, if you still feel like you have a strong reason to separate these out, you can follow this down this path. So you create the interface, you create that object, you have that reference there, and they can talk to each other. The logic can grab data from these other child elements and just use it and call the functions, and those functions inside of those other ones might call the original function back. But you have to have that called out, you have to understand that it is there. So that when you are making changes to it in the future, you're understanding, okay, I'm making a change to this data here, but that's also going to strongly affect this particular class over here, because they are coupled together. So you should be looking at how both of those classes. I have a general rule of thumb that anytime before you are going to edit a class, you need to make sure you understand everything that class does. Most classes should be very small. When you're following single responsibility, the size of the code is very easy, or at least very straightforward to read. If you have a file that's 10,000 lines long because it is dealing with an extraction of data from an old save file type and saving it to a new one, that makes sense that you would put that in just a single class. Because there might be 800 lines in it dedicated to just reading particular points in the data. And why split that out? You could, but you don't need to. You understand everything that is going on inside of this class. So you can have larger class files, but usually single responsibility suggests that you would have smaller ones. So as long as you're following single responsibility, it's understanding everything that class is doing is usually pretty easy. It's where you end up with these monolithic game.cs files or other management system files that somehow just arbitrarily grow and start holding all of this unorganized data and class structure. All right, so assuming that those are okay, you then call out that you have these references, you mark that you have a cyclical reference, there's not like a flag or something in it, you put it in your documentation. Now you need to have lightweight documentation that calls out these things that stand out, like what are the key architectures that you're using and how you're using them. What are some points that stand out? Like these three classes, it's domain data, not just architectural data, but it calls out that these three classes have to be treated as one. If you're going to edit one, you need to understand all three. You should not have overlapping cyclical references. So if you have another system that is also somehow cross-connected, that this class is cross-connected with this class, it should not be cross-connected with another one. Unless it's part of a trifecta where all three are connected. But then we're getting, the farther you expand that, the harder and harder it gets to maintain, because the more things you have to understand. In older codes, the spaghetti code that we're talking about, it's like creating all these cyclical references where everything is supposed to understand the nature of how every other piece of code works. And really we want to keep that isolated and simple, because that makes what we have to think about when we're building this less. Okay. Anyway, so that's some of the ways that you can manage this, you can deal with this, and how to produce this code, or at least several of the ways that I deal with this. Anyway, hope that's helpful. And I am planning on starting to produce more of these architectural videos to explain things, hopefully in smaller, more isolated extent. But if anyone else has questions, please feel free to send them in. I would be happy to respond and give some more answers. You can connect to me on LinkedIn if you want to try connecting to get in touch with me. I'm also available on Discord in general, and what's that other one? Patreon. Yeah, I'm on Patreon. All right, I'll talk to you later.